The Echoes of Blackwood House. Lena Grant had never heard of Blackwood House until the day she inherited it. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, its contents stark and brief. It informed her that she was the sole heir to her late aunt, Margaret Blackwood, a woman Lena had never met or even heard of. The letter included the keys to the house, a remote property in the deep woods of New Hampshire, along with instructions to visit the estate as soon as possible to settle the inheritance. Curiosity outweighed caution, and Lena, always one for an adventure, decided to see this mysterious house for herself. With no family to speak of and a life that felt increasingly empty, she was eager for a change of pace, no matter how strange the circumstances. The drive to Blackwood House took longer than expected. The GPS lost signal miles before she reached the town of Hollow Creek, forcing her to rely on the map provided with the letter. The winding, narrow road leading to the house was overgrown and nearly impassable. But after what felt like hours of navigating treacherous terrain, she finally reached the gate. The house loomed before her, a massive, crumbling edifice that seemed to have been plucked from another century. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and the windows were dark, lifeless eyes staring out into the dense forest that encircled the property. The gate creaked as Lena pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent woods like a warning. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as Lena made her way up the stone path to the front door. She hesitated, the weight of the keys heavy in her hand, before inserting one into the lock. The door opened with a groan, revealing a dark foyer, the interior as cold and unwelcoming as the exterior. Lena stepped inside, her footsteps echoing off the marble floor. The air was stale, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. The house was huge, with high ceilings and long hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, their eyes following her as she moved through the rooms. There was an unsettling stillness to the place, as if it had been frozen in time. It was clear that no one had lived here for years, maybe decades, yet everything was perfectly preserved, as if waiting for someone to return. Lena's unease grew as she explored the house. There was something off about it, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just the silence or the dust, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of her vision. It was a feeling, a sense of being watched, of not being alone. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger the deeper she ventured into the house. By the time she reached the grand staircase that led to the upper floors, she was on edge, her nerves frayed and her heart pounding in her chest. The staircase creaked under her weight as she ascended, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The second floor was even darker than the first, the heavy drapes drawn over the windows, blocking out what little light there was. She reached for a nearby lamp, and to her surprise, found that it worked, casting a dim, flickering light that did little to dispel the shadows. Lena made her way down the hallway, stopping at each door to peer inside. Most of the rooms were bedrooms, each one more decayed and dilapidated than the last. The beds were still made, the sheets yellowed with age, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. At the end of the hallway was a door that stood out from the others. It was smaller, almost hidden in the shadows, and when Lena tried the handle, she found it locked. She hesitated for a moment before remembering the ring of keys in her pocket. She fumbled with them, trying one after another until she found the right one. The door swung open with a soft click, revealing a small, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something else, something metallic. Lena's heart skipped a beat. This was the basement, she realized. She had yet to explore it, but something about the darkness below made her hesitate. There was an oppressive, almost malevolent energy emanating from the space, and every instinct she had screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But she couldn't. Something drew her forward, an inexplicable compulsion to see what lay below. She fished out her phone, turning on the flashlight app, and began her descent. The stairs were steep and narrow, and each step echoed in the confined space. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It was the smell of blood, she realized, and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large, open space. The walls were made of rough stone, and the floor was dirt, uneven and damp. Her flashlight flickered as she swept it across the room, revealing a large wooden table in the center, covered in dust and cobwebs. But it was what lay beyond the table that made her blood run cold. A row of iron cages lined the far wall, each one barely large enough to hold a person. They were old, rusted, the bars bent and broken in places. But what terrified Lena was that they were not empty. The skeletal remains of several people lay inside the cages, their bones picked clean, their empty eye sockets staring out at her accusingly. Lena gasped, stumbling back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She wanted to run, to get out of this nightmare, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen with terror. She wasn't alone in this house. She had never been alone. The sound of footsteps echoed through the basement, and Lena spun around, her flashlight beam jerking wildly as she searched for the source. But there was no one there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they were right behind her. She turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but the basement was empty. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her heart in her ears. And then the whispering started. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire room. The voices overlapped, merging into a single, incomprehensible chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lena backed away, her hands shaking, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out, had to leave this place before it was too late. But as she turned to flee, something caught her eye. On the far wall, just beyond the cages, was a door she hadn't noticed before. It was made of heavy iron-bound wood, and it was ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and Lena felt a strange pull toward the door, a compulsion to see what lay beyond. Against her better judgment, she moved toward it, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She reached out, hesitating for only a moment before pushing the door open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves filled with books and jars of strange, preserved specimens. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. But it was what lay on the altar that made Lena's blood run cold. A small black book, bound in leather and covered in strange symbols, lay open on the altar, its pages filled with intricate, arcane writing that seemed to writhe and twist on the page. As she approached, the whispering grew louder, more frantic, the voices merging into a single, deafening scream that echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of overwhelming dread. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, and Lena slowly reached out, her hand trembling, to touch the book. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, a shock of pain shot through her, and the world exploded into darkness. Lena woke to the sound of a low, rhythmic chant. It was deep and resonant, like the sound of distant thunder, and it seemed to vibrate through her entire body. She was lying on something hard and cold, her arms and legs bound to it by thick, rough ropes. Panic surged through her as she tried to move, but the ropes held tight, digging into her skin. Her head throbbed with pain, and her vision was blurred, the room spinning as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. She was still in the small, dimly lit room, but now it was filled with shadows, dark shapes that moved and writhed in the corners of her vision. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and she realized with a jolt of terror that it was coming from the book on the altar, the pages glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Lena struggled against her bonds, trying to break free, but it was no use. The ropes were too tight, too strong, and she could feel them cutting into her skin, warm blood trickling down her arms and legs. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through the small chamber until it felt as though the sound was coming from within Lena's own skull. She writhed against the ropes binding her to the stone altar, her skin crawling with the sensation of something unseen pressing down on her, suffocating her. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and expand, creeping closer with each passing second. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she watched them coalesce into vaguely humanoid forms, their indistinct features twisted in ways that defied comprehension. These were not people, not anymore. They were something else, something ancient and malevolent. With each pulse of the chanting, the air in the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until Lena could see her breath misting in front of her. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, and the ropes binding her to the altar seemed to tighten, cutting off her circulation. The book on the altar suddenly snapped shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. The chanting ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on Lena like a physical weight. She could feel the malevolent presence in the room thickening, congealing around her, as though the very darkness itself was alive and hungry. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the room. It was unlike the whispering Lena had heard before. This voice was powerful, commanding, filled with an authority that brooked no defiance. Lena staggered toward the door, the shadows lunging at her, trying to pull her back into the darkness. She swatted them away, feeling their icy tendrils slice through the air around her, but she kept moving, refusing to look back. She reached the door and flung it open, stumbling into the dark hallway beyond. The house was a labyrinth of shadows and echoing whispers, but Lena didn't care. She had to find a way out. She ran through the darkened corridors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to shift and change around her, the walls closing in, the floor warping beneath her feet. The portraits lining the walls twisted and contorted, their eyes following her with malevolent glee. As she reached the grand staircase, the shadows surged up from the basement, a wave of darkness that threatened to engulf her. Lena hesitated for only a moment before she bolted up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps drowned out by the cacophony of whispering voices chasing her. She reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the hallway that led to the front door. The house seemed to sense her intentions, the shadows thickening around her, blocking her path. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was running out of time. Then, from somewhere deep within her mind, a memory surfaced, a fragment of a story her mother had told her when she was a child, a story about an ancient curse that had plagued her family for generations. A curse that could only be broken by the last of the bloodline. The memory was vague, fragmented, but Lena clung to it as her only hope. If she could find the source of the curse, maybe she could end it, end all of this. But where? The answer came to her in a flash of intuition, a sudden, overwhelming certainty that she had to go back to the basement. The very thought filled her with dread, but she knew it was the only way. With a deep breath, Lena turned and raced back down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows reached out for her, but she was faster, driven by a desperation she had never known. She reached the basement door and hesitated only for a moment before flinging it open and plunging down the stairs. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she pushed through, her eyes locked on the door at the far end of the room, the door that had led to the chamber where she had found the book. The iron-bound door was still ajar, the faint light spilling out into the darkness. Lena forced herself to move forward, her hands trembling as she pushed the door open wider. The room was just as she had left it, the stone altar at the center, the shelves lining the walls. But the book was gone, replaced by a small, dark object that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. Lena approached the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the dark energy emanating from the object, a tangible force that pushed against her, trying to drive her away. But she didn't stop. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the object. A surge of pain shot through her, and the world exploded into darkness. When Lena awoke, she was no longer in the basement. The oppressive darkness, the cold stone floor, the smell of decay, all of it was gone. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of a vast, desolate landscape, a place that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. The sky was an unnatural shade of black, with no stars, no moon, nothing to break the endless void above. The ground was cracked and barren, devoid of any life, and the air was thick with the scent of sulfur and ash. Lena's heart raced as she looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was alone, but she could feel the presence of something or someone watching her, waiting. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon, and then she saw it. A figure standing far off in the distance, shrouded in shadows. The figure was tall and thin, its form indistinct and shifting, as if it were made of the same darkness that surrounded them. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Lena could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, fixed on her. A sense of overwhelming dread washed over her, and she took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was or how she had gotten here, but she knew she had to get away from that figure. But as she turned to run, the figure spoke. "Lena Blackwood," it said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the empty landscape. "You cannot escape your fate." Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure began to move toward her, gliding across the ground as if it were weightless. "What do you want?" Lena demanded, her voice trembling. "Why am I here?" The figure stopped a few feet away from her, its form still shrouded in shadows. "You are here because you are the last of the Blackwood line. The curse that has plagued your family for generations now rests upon you." "I don't know anything about a curse," Lena protested, her mind racing. "I don't even know who you are." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. "I am the one who was wronged," it said slowly. "The one who was betrayed by your ancestors. The one who placed the curse upon your bloodline." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" The figure's voice grew colder. "Centuries ago, your ancestor made a pact with me, a pact sealed in blood. But when the time came to fulfill his end of the bargain, he betrayed me." The figure's form seemed to shift, becoming darker, more menacing. "The curse can only be broken by the blood of the last Blackwood. You must complete the ritual your ancestor failed to finish." Lena's blood ran cold. "And if I refuse?" The figure's eyes, two pinpricks of red light, gleamed from within the shadows. "Then the curse will continue, and you will join the others, those who came before you, who tried to defy their fate." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The skeletal remains she had seen in the basement flashed through her mind, the bones of her ancestors, trapped in this nightmare for all eternity. She couldn't let that happen to her. She couldn't become another victim of this curse. But the thought of completing the ritual, of giving in to this malevolent force, filled her with a deep, primal fear. What would it mean for her? What would she have to sacrifice? As if sensing her hesitation, the figure spoke again. "There is no other way, Lena. You cannot escape this. You cannot run from your fate." Lena clenched her fists, her mind racing. She didn't want to die, didn't want to be trapped in this nightmare forever. But she also didn't want to be the one to perpetuate this curse, to condemn others to the same fate. She had to find a way out, had to break the cycle once and for all. But how? Her eyes darted around the barren landscape, searching for anything that could help her. And then she remembered the object she had found on the altar, the one that had brought her here. The figure seemed to sense her thoughts, and its form grew darker, more solid. "You cannot resist, Lena," it said, its voice growing harsher. "The ritual must be completed." Lena backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. "There has to be another way." But the figure advanced on her, its shadowy form stretching out toward her. "There is no other way," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You will complete the ritual, or you will suffer." Lena's mind raced as she tried to think of a plan, some way to escape this nightmare. But the figure was closing in on her, its dark energy pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then, in a moment of clarity, she realized what she had to do. The object on the altar, the one that had brought her here, it was the key. If she could destroy it, maybe she could break the curse, end this once and for all. The figure was almost upon her now, its shadowy form towering over her, its red eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Lena could feel the darkness closing in around her, choking her, suffocating her. With a surge of desperation, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the object, the small, dark object that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. She held it up, her hand shaking, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering and wavering. "No!" the figure screamed, its voice filled with rage. "You cannot destroy it!" Lena ignored the figure's words, focusing all her energy on the object in her hand. She could feel the dark energy emanating from it, a tangible force that pushed against her, trying to drive her away. But she didn't stop. She held the object tighter, her hand trembling with the effort, and then with a final desperate push, she smashed it against the ground. The object shattered with a blinding flash of light, and the world around her exploded into chaos. The ground shook, the sky cracked open, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream as it dissolved into nothingness. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms disintegrating in the light. The dark energy that had surrounded Lena dissipated, leaving her gasping for breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The sky returned to its unnatural shade of black. The ground stopped shaking, and the silence that followed was deafening. Lena fell to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had broken the curse. But as she looked around the barren landscape, she realized that she was still here, still trapped in this nightmare. And then she understood. The curse had been broken, but the price had been her freedom. She had saved her descendants, but she was now trapped in this desolate place, alone for all eternity. As the weight of her fate settled over her, Lena felt a single tear slide down her cheek. She had sacrificed everything to break the cycle, to end the suffering, and in doing so, she had condemned herself to a different kind of torment. But she knew deep down that it had been worth it. The last of the Blackwoods would not suffer the same fate as those who had come before. And as Lena sat alone in the endless void, she found peace. For she had become the final echo of Blackwood House, the one who had ended the curse, and the one who would be remembered in the whispers of those who came after. Years passed, and Blackwood House stood silent and abandoned in the deep woods of New Hampshire, its secrets buried along with the last of its cursed bloodline. The locals whispered of the haunted mansion deep in the woods, warning their children never to stray too far into the forest. But the house remained, a dark reminder of the horrors that had once plagued the Blackwood family. It was said that on certain nights, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the faint echoes of a woman's voice, carried on the breeze, a voice that had once belonged to Lena Blackwood, the last of her line. And those who were brave or foolish enough to venture into the woods at night would sometimes catch a glimpse of her, standing in the doorway of the old mansion, her eyes hollow, her face etched with the pain of her eternal torment. But the curse was broken, and the bloodline was free. And so Blackwood House, once a place of unimaginable suffering, was left to crumble and decay, a relic of a time long past, its dark legacy fading into myth and legend. But the echoes of that terrible night still lingered, whispering through the trees, a warning to all who dared to listen. Some curses are meant to be broken, but others are meant to be endured. And Lena Blackwood had done both, for she was the last echo of Blackwood House, and she would remain forever.